Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're decoding a concept called Western declinism. We're going to trace this from historical paranoia all the way to today's massive anxieties regarding China. To do this, we're unpacking some really fascinating commentary from historian Victor Davis Hanson, originally broadcast via the Daily Signal. We're going to explore this cyclical, almost relentless fear that America is constantly on the absolute brink of being overtaken. So let's find out if that fear is actually grounded in reality or if we're looking at something else entirely. Now, to properly set the stage and understand the ideological context of our source material, we need to quickly look at how the broadcast actually opens. Before Hanson even touches on geopolitical analysis, the program plays an advocacy ad from the Alliance Defending Freedom. It's heavily focused on domestic culture wars. Specifically, it pushes back against transgender athletes in women's sports and highlights some upcoming Supreme Court cases involving Title IX. But right after that, the host executes a really sharp pivot. We move instantly from those very heated domestic culture wars straight into the ultra-high stakes of global geopolitics. Hanson anchors his entire commentary on the recent Chinese-American summit, which he notes has triggered some serious anxiety. If you look across Wall Street, within the military, and really across the whole political spectrum, there is this palpable, growing fear that China is finally the power poised to permanently replace the United States on the world stage. So what's Hanson's actual take on all this? Well, the absolutely crucial point he argues is that these modern fears about China aren't exactly new. Actually, Hanson diagnoses this anxiety as a classic symptom of Western declinism. He defines this as a recurring phenomenon of profound pessimism and paranoia. It's almost like an intrinsic habit within Western societies to just panic that a rival power is inevitably going to replace them. He strongly argues this is a psychological condition we go through, rather than an empirical reality. To actually prove that the U.S. isn't in some sort of empirical decline, Hanson lists out the foundational ingredients you need for a flourishing society. And he points out that the U.S. absolutely dominates the essentials. Just look at fuel. The U.S. is currently the largest producer of gas and oil in the world. For food, the nation is completely self-sufficient and happens to be the biggest exporter globally. And when it comes to STEM education, get this, the U.S. houses an incredible 90% of the world's top 50 universities. Institutions like Caltech and MIT are literally leading the entire globe. You know the old saying, demographics are destiny, right? Well, the data here reveals a really stark contrast. Hanson points out that, sure, the U.S. fertility rate of 1.7 isn't a perfect replacement rate of 2.0, but it remains vastly superior to its geopolitical peers. It comfortably beats Europe's 1.3, and it completely overshadows China's rate of 1.0. Hanson emphasizes that China is rapidly becoming a shrinking and aging society, which, if you think about it, severely undermines the whole narrative of their unstoppable rise. Rounding out his checklist of hard, empirical American strength, Hanson points right to defense and space exploration. The U.S. military budget remains totally unprecedented in real dollars. The U.S. literally invented the aircraft carrier and today operates 11 strike groups loaded with the world's most sophisticated weaponry. And looking beyond our atmosphere, American dominance is secured not just by NASA, but by private powerhouses like SpaceX. In fact, Hanson notes SpaceX on its own is superior to almost all other national space programs combined. Okay, having firmly established current U.S. supremacy, Hanson then takes us on this really fascinating chronological journey through past panics. We're essentially looking at a century of pseudo-threats, these huge cultural moments when Americans falsely believed their system was totally obsolete. From fascist Europe in the 30s all the way to the EU in the 2000s, let's break down exactly how the intense paranoia of the moment contrasted with the ultimate reality. Let's rewind first to the 1930s. During the Great Depression, U.S. unemployment hit a staggering 25%, and a deep, deep paranoia set in. Many Americans looked over at fascist Italy and Germany and saw this seemingly superior new paradigm of wonderful infrastructure and incredibly rapid rearmament. By 1939, you had famous figures like Charles Lindbergh warning that decrepit U.S. forces couldn't possibly beat the invincible German Luftwaffe. But the reality? Just a few years later, the U.S. had completely destroyed its enemies. Its economy had outgrown all belligerent nations combined, and it built the single largest navy in human history. The paranoia was completely shattered. And this brilliantly illustrates how the cycle just repeats itself. Right after World War II, a brand new terror emerged, the Soviet Union. The prevailing fear back then was that their totalitarian command economy was simply more efficient than ours. Americans panicked over the space race, the Soviets' massive 100-megaton bomb, and a perceived missile gap that literally helped elect JFK. Nikita Khrushchev famously warned the US, "We will bury you." Yet history tells a very different story. It was a pathological, rotten system. Just 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell, the entire Soviet apparatus imploded. Hanson even notes that the CIA's estimates of Soviet economic vitality were completely, fundamentally wrong the whole time. You'd think we'd learned, right? But the declinism didn't stop. By the 1980s, the national panic shifted entirely to Japan Inc. Pessimists became utterly convinced that Japan's fusion of government and business was the absolute model of the future. American automakers were allegedly doomed. Hollywood was pumping out paranoid films, and Americans watched in absolute shock as Japanese billionaires bought up iconic U.S. assets like Rockefeller Center. But instead of global domination, backed by some unwise policies and an aging demographic, Japan fell into 15 years of destructive deflation. Today, they remain a prosperous, great friend, but certainly not the global rival that was somehow going to bankrupt America. Fast forward again to the new millennium. With Japan and the Soviets out of the picture, fears shifted to a newly united European Union. Alarmists were suddenly pointing to a bloc of 450 million united people and a euro surging in value to $1.16, all while the U.S. was bogged down in Middle Eastern conflicts. Henry Kissinger famously quipped, "Who do I call if I want to call Europe?" Ultimately, though, Hanson argues the EU adopted utopian green energy and open border policies while severely neglecting their defense. The result? Their economy shrank to just 65% the size of America's today. So, having walked through this entire century of false alarms, it brings us squarely back to the present and to a really critical question. When we look at the immense anxiety happening right now on Wall Street and in Washington regarding Beijing, we have to ask ourselves, is China the exception to the rule? Does the current fear break this deeply ingrained historical pattern we just looked at, or is it literally just the newest verse of the exact same song? Well, for Victor Davis Hanson, the answer is totally unambiguous. His definitive conclusion is that China is not a new, unstoppable rival destined to replace the United States. Not at all. Instead, he claims that China is currently facing severe economic, cultural, and political crises, especially when you compare them to the foundational strengths of the U.S. we discussed earlier. To him, China is merely the latest pseudo-threat, just the newest iteration in that long, long line of perceived threats that includes 1930s Germany, the Soviet Union, and Japan Inc. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to really ponder. If we accept Hanson's premise that Western declinism is this persistent, recurring paranoia, we kind of have to wonder about its ultimate function. Are we simply foolishly misinterpreting the threat of rival powers over and over again? Or, actually, is this declinism, this constant nagging paranoia that someone is always about to beat us, the very fuel that forces Western societies to innovate, correct their course, and ultimately stay at the top? It's a fascinating lens to view history through. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.